Okay, AP Euro. So today we're going to do agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. The agricultural revolution, a really good start date for that is 1701 because that's when Jethro Tull came up with his seed drill. But the enclosure acts are 1750 to 1760, so that's kind of when most of the agricultural revolution is taking place into the later half of the century. Nothing more than the agricultural revolution leads to the population growth that you get in the 18th century. It really is a boom. All of the good food that led to healthier immune systems and not so much famine and all the rest of it, all of that contributed to a very healthy population boom. All right, so the agricultural revolution in some ways started with the Dutch. They were playing with dams and canals, and because the Netherlands is so flat and floods easily, they had already come up with ways to to sort of dam water and to divert it so that you could grow things. And also they had been playing around with manure before the British. But the British is when we think of the agricultural revolution, we really think of Britain. So before the agricultural revolution, people did strip farming, and there was a common area where animals could graze, but different strips, and people had old-fashioned tools like wooden hoes and that kind of thing, and it was really inefficient. And you might have a strip over here, but also a strip over here, and you had to trudge over there, and it took time, and nobody could do very much with their small strips, and so it was not very efficient, and you really didn't produce enough food to have much of a surplus to sell. But in 1701, growing out of the scientific revolution, we see people experimenting with ways to make crops improve. And we have Jethro Tull seed drill, which planted things in a straight line so that then you would have a straight line next to it where you could walk and not trample on crops. Another thing that had happened before the agricultural revolution was you needed to leave land fallow because grain takes up a lot of nutrients out of the soil, and you need to give soil time to put for the nitrogen to come back again, and you need to leave a field fallow. But Charles Turnip Townsend came up with crop rotation, again, experimenting through the scientific revolution. He found out that if you planted things like clover, if you swapped your crops, that you could actually, then you never had to leave a field fallow. So you could grow your grain, and then the next season you could grow clover, and maybe people don't eat clover, but animals do, and so you could support your livestock. Or Swedes, turnips, that was another plant that was discovered to put nitrogen back into the soil. And so you would alternate your grain with your turnips, and thus you never have to leave any area unfarmed. So that was a great find. Robert Bakewell came up with selective breeding or scientific breeding. He was the one who thought, hey, if I take the biggest male cow and the biggest female cow and I mate them together, maybe I'll have a really big healthy baby. And sure enough, that worked. And so you started to see people selectively breeding their animals rather than just letting their animals do what animals will. So you started to get bigger animals to eat as well. But the enclosure acts really make using new inventions possible because it means you have a large farm in which to work. And so Parliament passed the enclosure acts in the 1750s and 60s, which basically said that you needed to prove that the land was yours, and once you could enclose it. You could have a hedge grown around it, and no one else could sort of come on it. And so that started to happen. The landed aristocracy, of course, were the only people who were in Parliament. The only members of Parliament were landed aristocracy at this point. This is before the 1832 Reform Bill. And so they just vote for the interests of the landed aristocracy. And so these enclosure acts passed without any kind of a hitch. Poor people couldn't prove the land was theirs. They couldn't afford lawyers, and they didn't have any kind of proof that any kind of land that they were farming was theirs. And so as they were replaced with even increasingly more inventions like the cast iron plow, they move off to the city. Now, the cast iron plow, Charles Newbold's cast iron plow, was not founded until 1797. So we're at the very end of the century when we really start to see the machines that replace humans come in. But at the end of the century, we know that, as you know, we've already studied this, but there's a huge movement as people move from the countryside into the cities. So about 1800, mass exodus as all of these farm laborers move into the city. All right, now, so the agricultural revolution leads into the industrial revolution because you need to have a workforce and you need to be able to feed that workforce, and you can only have an industrial revolution if you've had an agricultural revolution. And so we do see the first place that we really see industrialized is Britain, again, because that is where the agricultural revolution had taken place. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was Britain produced things through the putting out system, also known as the domestic system and sometimes cottage industry. A merchant would come to a home and drop off everything that was needed to make shoes or make cloth or make clothes, and families would work together to produce whatever it was that they were going to produce, and then they would get paid piece rate, per piece, per item, per shoe that they produced. The merchant would come back and pay them accordingly. And the good thing about this was that families could choose their own hours then. If they were sick one day, they didn't have to work. They wouldn't get paid anything because they wouldn't have produced any pieces, but nevertheless, they could take that day off and then work together the next day. But families worked together. It was a very tight unit, the family working together in the cottage industry, in the putting out system, and they worked in their home. There were spinning wheels that could be foot pumped within the home. All right, but starting with Richard Arkwright's invention of the water frame, we really do see that start to change. The water frame was in 1771, and what Sir Richard Arkwright's water frame meant was that you could power your loom not manually, but through water power. And so you needed to have a factory along along a river, along water, and eventually that could even be replaced with coal, with steam power. So please do remember Sir Richard Arkwright, that water frame. I always remember Mr. Thornton in North and South when he's at the Crystal Palace explaining his machinery, talking about the wonders of Sir Richard Arkwright's water frame. So it really was a big deal. Okay, so lots of other reasons why the Industrial Revolution occurs in Britain, but the most important is that they had this agricultural revolution. Some other reasons: they had good resources, they had coal, they could mine coal easily, they had a good transport system, they were an island, so they weren't at war with any other country. Sometimes in mainland Europe you have, skirmishes that are taking place, wars that are taking place. The Napoleonic Wars are taking place until 1814, 15. So, but England, at home anyway, even though the British are fighting Napoleon, it's abroad. At home, there's no fighting happening on English soil, so you can put your energy towards something like industry. The government was a laissez-faire government. It was a leave things alone, hands off, and so there was no regulation. So if you had an entrepreneurial spirit, as many British did, and you wanted to go to the bank, banks were willing to lend credit. You could put together your factory, and there were no hoops that you had to jump through. You could really just do it however you wanted to. And so this laissez-faire government really did lead to a huge push in industry. Later, they'll have to step that back a little bit and have some reforms. They'll have to make laws like, the Factory Act, children under 12 not working in factories anymore, or like the Mines Act, children and women not working in mines. They will have to pass laws about things like safety regulations. But for in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, before reforms start, before Sadler starts investigating and Chadwick starts investigating housing, etc., you really have landlords and factory owners doing whatever they please. So in Britain, we have this Industrial Revolution. Hand in hand with these factories going up are back-to-back houses. These workers need to be able to get to the factory easily. They need to be able to walk there, and so lots of cheap housing goes up quickly around the factories. These back-to-back homes, they shared a yard, and the yard would have a privy, usually a shared privy and a shared water pump. But you can imagine with so many people sharing one privy and one water pump, you're not going to wait with your 2-year-old for the privy in the middle of the night if there's a line, or you get my drift. So really kind of gross living conditions. Again, laissez-faire government meant that there were no regulations for these landlords, so they could build. They didn't have to follow a code. They could just build however the cheapest way possible. And so we really do have these appalling living conditions. The worst conditions were probably in the cellar with the mud floors. Remember, these families who were coming from the countryside, they would bring everything they had with them. So if they had a pig in the countryside, pig came with them, and pig would be living in the house with them. I mean, when you think about it, it's really quite awful. The awful conditions are perhaps most memorable for you through those Punch cartoons that we looked at. Perhaps the most famous is the Court for King Cholera. These courts, or these yards, these courtyards, where the privy and the pump were really horrible. Because there was no regulation, maybe a farmer would come and empty the dung heap, take away the privy waste to use as manure. But if he didn't feel like it, there was no law that said he had to. And so this dung heap could build and build. And in that Court for King Cholera punch cartoon, you see the kids playing in the dung heap in the front, and it's really gross. You see the woman rummaging through and holding up that fish scales, the fish bones. So crowded, dirty, not really good living conditions at all. So let's see. Another another punch cartoon would be Father Thames introducing his children to the fair city of London, and because the Thames was where everything was dumped to, and so it was very dirty. And Father Thames he looks like Father Christmas, and he's bringing his gifts to the fair city of London, but his gifts are scrofula and diphtheria and cholera. Cholera was the big baddie. In 1832, there was a huge cholera outbreak. Thousands of people died, and cholera doesn't care if you're rich or poor. And so suddenly middle class and upper class people started to wake up to maybe we need to clean up our cities, because this isn't just bad for the people, the poor people. This is bad for us as well. In 1842, Edwin Chadwick wrote his report into the living conditions of the laboring populations, and he really did make that connection that the bad health, the cholera and all was caused by these poor living conditions. He hadn't quite figured out that cholera was spread through water, but he was on to something. So he's a big reformer. He's our sort of housing reformer. We also have the Sadler Committee started to do parliamentary sort of investigations into child labor. It was a big change moving from the home where you worked in the putting out system together into the factory. You weren't having your parents discipline you anymore. And employers often like to employ children because they were tiny. They could fit under machines as scavengers and piecers with their tiny fingers. And you could pay them less, and they were more malleable. You could sort of order them around a little bit more. But those overseers were scary, and they definitely used physical punishment to keep those kids in line. Oftentimes families split up. When you think about North and South, remember Bessie Higgins doesn't work in the same factory as her father, Nicholas. Do remember that North and South is extra evidence that you can bring in. Elizabeth Gaskell was writing at the time, and her Milton is very much based on Manchester. So please do use that. And I love that quote when she writes to her cousin, "I have seen hell, and it's white, pure white, because of all the cotton fluff that was everywhere." Remember, with no regulations, the cotton fluff would be ingested, breathed in, and it would sort of sit on your lungs. And people did not live very long if they were working in these factories. Coal mines, no better. Interestingly, the reformers with the coal mines seemed more interested or horrified by the fact that the women were working topless than anything else. They saw this as a sort of immoral. Remember, a lot of people already had the attitude that the poor were more lascivious, less moral than wealthier people anyway, and so it just kind of horrified them. These men and women working together under the ground, these women topless, and so they fought to have women not work in the mines anymore, and were successful with the Mines Act of, I think it was 1842. All right, there were big consequences. The Industrial Revolution had huge consequences. One of the biggest, it seems to me, are these poor living and working conditions, which will ultimately have to be reformed. I always think of the first half of the 19th century as sort of awfulness, and then the second half, increasingly, say about 1840 onward, we have this push for reform. Remember, Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report into the living conditions of the laboring class did result several years later, 6 years later, 1848, England has its first Public Health Act passed. And that must be a response to Chadwick's findings. And remember, it didn't go far enough. It didn't make things mandatory, but that Health Act did say that that towns and cities could make up their own little health municipal sort of organizations that could try to address Chadwick's two big concerns, which were clean water and waste removal. So clean water and waste removal. In the second half of the 19th century, we also see Napoleon III take those concerns seriously. Yes, he wants to make bigger roads so that he cannot be blocked. His soldiers can't be blocked if there are riots and uprisings, because one of the things that the revolutionaries did in the 1830 revolution is they built these barricades through the medieval streets, and the king's troops couldn't get through. So when Napoleon III becomes emperor, one of the things he does is he razes Paris, he gets rid of medieval Paris, and he rebuilds it with these huge boulevards, the Champs-Élysées being the most famous of them, but that was so his troops could go through. But another thing that he did is once you've dug up the road, you might as well put in a good sewer system, and so he put in pipes, put in waste removal, and clean water. And these are things that are going to keep your people happy. And you put in huge public parks so that all Parisians could come together and have some space outside. The 19th century is also a time of cleaning up these really dirty cities and making them more livable and beautiful, with parks and light, gas light, and then electric light outside, so that people can go outside in the evenings and feel safe. So that's happening as well. Let's see, cleaning up the cities. The Romantic movement is a response to the Industrial Revolution. The Romantics were horrified by the ugliness of these mines and these smokestacks and these factories, and just the ugliness of urban life, and how everybody was just so interested in money. And so the Romantics responded with a push for nature and going out into nature, and they really saw God in nature. And so they thought that these cities they were God-forsaken places, and that really we should return to the natural world and go out there. And remember, Friedrich is a good example with his Arctic shipwreck, the sublime, that nature is all powerful and that God can be found in nature. The Wanderer in the Mist, or the Monk in the Sea. Those are some great Friedrich paintings. Other Romantics are Delacroix. Remember, Liberty Leading the People and the Massacre at Chios. We're going to do that when we talk about the Romantics a little bit in more depth when we talk about our Age of Ideology next time. But all of that is happening. So definitely Romanticism is a response to the Industrial Revolution, and Marxism, French utopian socialists, and then bleeding into Marxism with the Communist Manifesto as a response. This new class of laborer, this working class working in the factory, working under terrible working conditions with no limits on how long they work, and very little pay, really do lead to some experimental ways and try to fix this problem. And so Karl Marx arguing that, all history has been a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, and one day these proletariats are going to rise up against their bourgeoisie factory owners, and they are going to overthrow them. And then everybody will produce according to what they can do, and everything will be shared. It's a very idealistic way of thinking about the world. It doesn't take into consideration human nature. And so when it is put into practice after the Bolshevik Revolution, we see a lot of pain and suffering. It doesn't quite work out the way that Karl Marx had envisioned, but nevertheless, that is another response to the Industrial Revolution. There were people like Robert Owen who tried to put together factories that were friendly to their workers. New Lanark was his mill, and he paid his workers well, and he had the children go to school, and he had limited hours that they worked, and he really thought that everybody else would come on board with this more humane sort of factory template, but nobody did, and he kind of died disillusioned, which is too bad. There were also the Luddites who followed a guy called Ned Ludd, and they would break into factories and they would try to destroy everything, because they were usually hand loom weavers, people who worked with their hands, and they were replaced by factories. They were artisans who were replaced by these factories, and so obviously they didn't like their jobs being taken away. So they would break into the factories and try to burn them down, and when they were caught, as they usually were, they were often sent to Australia, convicts sent to Australia. And so that's another sort of response to the Industrial Revolution. Let's see. I think we have some people respond to this new working class sort of unsympathetically, you could say. Thomas Malthus, I think, with his essay on the principle of population, argues that poverty and misery are unavoidable because population growth increases faster than the food supply, so that actually you need things like famine and all the rest of it to keep the population in check. Otherwise, there's too much population growth. And Malthus took those ideas and applied it to economics with the iron law of wages, that really you should only pay workers enough so that they can feed themselves, because if you feed them more than that, if you give them more money than that, they will have bigger families, and they're producing more workers, therefore, and ultimately they're hurting themselves, because the workforce will grow and there won't be enough jobs and people will get hungry again. And so again, to keep the price that you pay people, the income that you're giving people, very low, just enough so that people can feed themselves. There's also an explosion of helping the poor that results from social Darwinism that comes about in the second half of the 19th century. Remember, Charles Darwin comes up with survival of the fittest and his ideas of evolution, and Herbert Spencer took those ideas and applied them to people, and so that it follows that some people must be more fit than others, and so maybe the bourgeoisie are bourgeoisie because they just are more fit than the proletariat, the workers down there at the bottom, and it's justifiable for the bourgeoisie to work them hard. This also when we talk about imperialism in 2 weeks, this will feed into imperialism, that maybe some countries are more fit than other countries, and isn't it, sort of natural law? It's God's law that the more fit countries should go and take over the less fit countries. People didn't see anything wrong with this, and so all of these new ideas are coming about because of this new working class as well. Imperialism is a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. People need new markets. People need, people need to secure new raw materials. Rubber in what's now Vietnam, but what was then Indochine. The French went in so that they could take over the rubber trees and have rubber plantations there. Manganese for steel. All sorts of things. Diamonds in Southern Africa, and so that's another sort of consequence, perhaps an unforeseen consequence. Let's see. So I think that's pretty much all that I want you to know about the Industrial Revolution, coming out of the Agricultural Revolution. Also part of the Industrial Revolution is the age of steam. Watt comes up with the steam engine, or he improves upon the steam engine. So James Watt is maybe a name that you could know. We really do see this. It's actually... It's Thomas Newcomen who comes up with the steam engine in 1712, but it's James Watt who improves upon that in 1769. And, then you get a steamship in 1807, so that will make, going into the Congo easy on your little steamboat, and the like. So I think that's pretty much what I want you to know about the agricultural and the Industrial Revolution. Please know that there's lots of extra evidence that you can bring in for this if you get a DBQ on it. Don't forget about your Sadler Committee, the parliamentary reforms. Don't forget about Edwin Chadwick. Don't forget about your Punch cartoons. Don't forget about North and South, or any Charles Dickens that you've read. All of these things can be helpful to you. Perhaps I should also say that we start to see, as England moves from being an agricultural country to an industrial country, we start to see the parliament change and shift. Remember, Parliament was all landed aristocracy before 1832, but there was a real push against that. In 1815, when Napoleon was, his reign was ended with the Congress of Vienna, the continental system ended, and so the French could trade with Britain again, and all of this really cheap grain started flooding Britain, and so Parliament responded because they were looking out for their own landed aristocracy interests with the Corn Laws. They put taxes on the French grain so that you couldn't afford it, so that you would buy British grain. Well, that made factory owners really angry because they want their workers to be able to buy the least expensive food possible, because then you can pay them less. And so as these industrial factory owners, these were men who were educated and they had wealth, they started to clamor for change as well as the workers. Plus the fact that everybody kind of moved from the south of England to the north now, with this shift from agriculture to industry. And there were still areas in the south that had members of parliament, MPs, but they didn't even have any people being represented anymore there. The people had all left and moved to the north. Those rotten boroughs made everybody angry. So there were uprisings. The Peterloo Massacre in 1819 in Manchester Square. We have agitation. People are there's a lot of unease, and so Parliament does pass the 1832 Reform Bill, which gets rid of rotten boroughs and redistricts so that the industrial areas in the north have some representation too. It didn't go quite far enough, and as you know, the Chartists come along in the 30s. They write their charter, I think, in 1836, and they want members of Parliament to be paid. They want there to be no property distinction for somebody to become an MP. They want annual elections. They will not get that. They want secret ballot, and they want universal male suffrage. Interestingly, everything they want except the annual elections will eventually come to pass, but not quite yet. And they're agitating for change. Disraeli will pass a reform bill in 1867 so that more workers in the north, landowners, or I shouldn't say landowners, people who pay rent, people who own a home or pay a certain amount of rent can now have a vote. And then that's extended to agricultural workers in 1884 through Gladstone. But you should know that there's still there's still thousands and thousands of people who can't vote. We're talking about before World War I, only 60% of men can vote. You still have 40% of the poorest men cannot vote. No women can vote, and it really does take a world war for people to start to think that that needs to change. And so, but we do see increased representation in Parliament in Britain during this time period. Next class we'll talk about what's going on in mainland Europe as well during when we're doing our isms, but things are relatively peaceful in Britain. We don't see the huge bloodshed that we see in France, for example, with the 1830 and the 1848 revolutions. It is true that those of you who are in my English class who read Emmeline Pankhurst's Why We Are Militant, she does point to male violence helping to bring about those 1867 and 1884 reform bills, but it's nowhere like the violence that's happening, in mainland Europe. So when we think of the vote in Britain, I think anyway of evolutionary process, whereas in mainland Europe, we're talking about a revolutionary process. There's a lot more fighting and dying that has to happen before people are given a vote there. Okay, well, I kept this one a little bit shorter than last week's, so that's good. Hope you guys are doing well, and we will talk about the 5 isms and the age of ideology next little video. Okay, bye-bye.